Alright, well, it's time to talk about the flip side of last night's discussion, where I talk about my least favorite films by my favorite directors. And I actually briefly thought about doing a video on like my least favorite directors and their worst films, but the only names that came to mind were like Yuli Lommel and Uwe Boll, and no one really gives a shit about those guys. And along with that, I would like to point out the obvious fact before anyone jumps on my shit for these choices that I'm about to list. I need to point out, knowing how the internet works, that the title of this video starts with the words least favorite. I am not saying that they're the worst films by these directors, and I'm not even saying that they're all bad. In fact, the first three that I'm going to mention are films that I own on DVD, so, I mean, obviously I still like them. They're just not as good as some of the other films these directors have made. And unlike last night's video, this is actually going to be in a more particular order. I'm going to start with like the least bad movie and end it with the worst one. So anyway, with that nonsense out of the way, I'm going to start off with Quentin Tarantino. I've mentioned this before, but my least favorite movie that he's done so far would have to be Jackie Brown. Don't get me wrong, I do think it's a really good movie, and I like it, but it's just not quite as entertaining as his other films. It's just due to the fact that it doesn't have the same energy as like Pulp Fiction or obviously Kill Bill. And that's mainly because the movie wasn't necessarily directed towards people like me. Tarantino had like a particular demographic in mind when he was making the film, and that's cool. It's still a good story, great acting, a lot of funny moments. It's just, once again, not as entertaining as the rest of his films so far. Next one is Guillermo del Toro with his film Mimic. Again, I don't think it's awful. It's a really fun monster movie. I think the concept is pretty cool, but it's just not as memorable as his other films. It just doesn't suck me in quite as much. And, there were a few problems I found out which happened behind the scenes with the production of the film, so obviously the flaws with the movie weren't even his fault, so there's really not much else for me to say. My least favorite Guillermo del Toro film is Mimic. Counting down to number 3, my least favorite Peter Jackson film, which I mentioned that people could say the Hobbit movies are their favorite films that he's done. Some people would list those as his least favorite as well, which is kind of funny. But I'm not going to choose any of those. I actually love the Hobbit films. For me personally, my least favorite film that he's done that I've seen so far would be The Lovely Bones. I haven't seen Meet the Feebles or Heavenly Creatures yet, but I do intend to at some point. But yeah, in regards to The Lovely Bones, really my favorite part of that movie would be Stanley Tucci as the villain. I think he is incredibly creepy. And the film has some great emotional moments as well, and the visuals are, pretty good, but it just doesn't really have enough of an emotional hook for me. There are some sad moments, there are some suspenseful moments. Again, I really hated the villain in a good way. Like, I couldn't wait to see him get his comeuppance, but I don't know. Everything else about the film was just okay. And I've heard a couple of people now say that the book is so much better than the film. And, I do intend to read it at some point. For all I know, by the time I do, I could look back at the movie and say, yeah, this film's fucking garbage, and take it to Half Price Books. But until then, I'm going to keep the DVD. There are enough things that I enjoy about it. I'm not even going to edit out that last bit of awkwardness. So anyway, number 2 second place goes to Terry Gilliam for his film Jabberwocky, which is yet another one that I've mentioned before. Some people might cite The Brothers Grimm as their least favorite. Like, to my understanding, it flopped at the box office, and Gilliam himself was so disappointed in it that he just abandoned Hollywood to go back to his roots, which isn't a bad thing, but I don't know. Personally, I think it's a pretty fun movie. Jabberwocky is just about the complete opposite of that. It is just so clumsily edited and dull. The dialogue is clunky as shit. Like, they couldn't even talk about different types of sparrows or answer these questions 3. Not even anything as amusing as that. It's just a pretty forgettable movie overall. I can't really say much else about it. And then finally, number 1 goes to Kevin Smith. Some people might cite Jersey Girl as his worst movie. Honestly, I love that film. And then others might even mention Clerks 2, which I've already said is a film that I like. But as I mentioned, he has to screw up pretty badly to make a film that I dislike. And he never went any worse than with the film Cop Out. It didn't even feel like a Kevin Smith movie. It felt like a later film by the Farrelly brothers, which isn't a compliment. It did make me laugh once at the beginning when Tracy Morgan was doing his bad cop routine and just was spouting a bunch of random shit. It made me laugh once during that scene, and then after that, nothing. Tracy Morgan just ended up getting on my nerves after a while. Then he meets a criminal who gets on his nerves, and then the criminal becomes his friend and then dies. So that was completely fucking pointless. And I can't even remember a thing that Bruce Willis did in the movie. He was about as interesting as wet paper. Yeah, there's not much else for me to say about the film, except, as was the case with Terry Gilliam's Brothers Grimm, this film did have a silver lining to it, you know, after it turned out so horribly, it caused Kevin Smith to go back to his independent roots to make the film Red State, which is, you know, a huge silver lining. So, in the end, every director is bound to flop at some point, even though Quentin Tarantino hasn't done that quite yet. Hopefully The Hateful Eight is going to stand up to the rest of his films, but anyway, that's my list. I hope y'all have a good one.